language of kayfabe starts to come into the picture when it comes to Ozzy, and is seemingly inescapable when it comes to Christian culture in 2025.
This is Rock That Doesn't Roll, the story of Christian music. I'm Andrew Gill, a music journalist who grew up listening to Christian rock.
And I'm Leah Payne, author of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, a history of contemporary Christian music.
And today on the show, we're joined by another music journalist who grew up listening to Christian rock, Jason P. Woodbury, the aquarium drunkard guy, the host of Transmissions, the Aquarium Drunkard podcast. Well, there's another guy, right? You're not
there's multiple
Drunkard.
guys. But yeah, Justin Gage is the founder of Aquarium Drunkard.
Yes.
He hosts the Sirius XM show, but I host the Transmissions podcast, and I edit the site with Justin and help out over there.
Yeah, and if our listeners haven't heard Transmissions, it's great. There's quite a range of artists that you've interviewed over the years, and you often get them talking about stuff they don't talk about other places. So it's a good listen.
Thank you.
An old internet acquaintance of mine is your producer, Andrew Horton. He goes way back to my Christian indie days.
Well, Andrew goes back to my Crindy days. We probably met him through the same message board or whatever, But
yeah,
I remember.
I was on the Velvet Blue Music email
list.
Okay.
And it was that, and then there was there's a Vagrant Cafe, message board that was associated, and so a lot of crossover there. Andrew hit me to a lot of cool stuff, but was also associated with the whole crindy thing for sure.
That's right. He became a member of Joy Electric.
He's played live with Joy Electric, So that's practically Christian indie royalty right there.
But so that's catnip for a certain section of our audience. But the reason we wanted to have you on today is because I was reading a post you made on your Substack about Ozzy Osbourne. May he rest in peace. And I thought it was a good conversation to bring to this podcast because, I was able to insert a little something into an emergency podcast we did for Sound Opinions, just pointing out the irony of the Prince of Darkness actually possibly birthing Christian metal. And so, why don't we just start with, give us the thesis of your piece that you posted on Substack, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, I'm a big fan of a lot of Ozzy's music. I'm a big fan of Black Sabbath. But I've long harbored, the sort of opinion that essentially they were the first Christian metal band. I mean, they're the first metal band, period, really, in a lot of ways. In terms of, there's really valid arguments you could make about other groups in the U.S. or the U.K. who predated them in terms of doing the same sort of thing. Blues, really distorted. But, but Black Sabbath had, for me, my enjoyment of that music was sort of wrapped up in what you're talking about, which is this notion that I grew up hearing about Ozzy as this evil force, but then upon checking the music out myself, I found, to my surprise, that very often, if he wasn't explicitly articulating a worldview that was like my own as a young, Christian kid, if it wasn't explicit, a lot of times it still dovetailed pretty well with the whole thing, And so I realized, the sort of the occult and black magic ideas, they are in the mix here, but maybe in a sort of cautionary tale, in a sort of meta situation where I think if you just look at it, Black Sabbath is sort of just a spiritual band. And then what happens is, with Sabbath, it's not Ozzy who's writing those lyrics, it's Geezer for the most part. But as Ozzy does go on to solo work and starts to articulate his own worldview, even as he courts controversy and does play up the dark image. Like, I want to make it clear that, like, in no way is in my article not I'm acknowledging that Ozzy clearly knew what he was doing in terms of showmanship and playing to the heel, you know. It's come up on your guys' show before, but the language of kayfabe starts to come into the picture when it comes to Ozzy, and is seemingly inescapable when it comes to Christian culture in 2025. Kayfabe, this whole sort of, I don't know, meta idea. But anyway, back to Ozzy.
Yeah, the pro wrestling, suspension of reality for everyone involved in order to, enact a certain narrative, I guess.
That's right. But I mean, like, Ozzy, he ends up still being, like, very strangely, in his own way, a representative of kind of like hard rock bonehead innocence that is usually pretty nicely dovetails with sort of Christian ideas. And I mean, Blizzard of Oz, his solo debut, sort of got like an anti-porn like banger on it, where he's like talking about not watching pornography. He's got the song Mr. Crowley, where he is talking about the famous, wickedest man in the West or whatever. And he's like saying, your life seemed like such a tragedy. It's like everything he's saying is, I don't want to say it's like Veggie Tales or Carmen or whatever, but
or
like
Witch's Invitation.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also way more like, the stuff that I was actually reading in my Bible or considering in Bible studies. The territory was like more overlapping than I ever could have realized. So Sabbath and Ozzy ends up serving as a sort of gateway for me to recognize, maybe other art that was dismissed or I was even warned against as a young person is worth exploring. And so in some ways it kind of kicked off that journey a little bit.
Rock that doesn't roll.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
I'm going to enter right there because the Crindy, I didn't have the Crindy experience, and I just learned that just now. Is that something that people say?
That's a thing that Andrew Horton is trying to make. It's like trying to make fetch happen.
Make fetch happen?
Like,
I do understand that cultural reference.
It's a lot like that.
That is so funny. Okay. Sorry. I've just been playing catch up on that one. But I really, so my apologies. But I guess my first question for you is, Jason, can you tell us a little bit about your entry into the Christian music space and like what you would have been pairing that knowledge with?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in a like extremely religious household, and had a very deeply church ingrained youth through first a First Christian church in Chandler, Arizona, and then later my family moved to a more rural town called Coolidge, and essentially it was a kind of family church. My uncle was the preacher, my grandpa was one of the elders, my dad was a song leader, my uncle was a song leader. I started leading singing in the congregation before puberty. In fact, experienced some effects of puberty while leading singing in front of a very Brady Bunch kind of situation, where I maybe started the service in one octave and ended in another. But the truth is, like, so music was super tied to my understanding of religion, faith. It was integral to the way I experienced that. But my parents, for whatever reason, they weren't super strict about what I listened to. They certainly would express concern if something seemed too spooky or whatever, but they weren't really hardline about it. So I experienced Christian rock in my youth, somewhat just through other friends who listened to that stuff more. But really, I start to really invest when I get into pop punk and emo and then indie rock stuff, all through the lens sort of Tooth and Nail and stuff. And so in high school, I was sort of seeking that stuff out, not because I had to, that was the only option I had, but honestly because I felt like a lot of the music that I listened to, even on the secular front, quote unquote, was dealing with similar stuff. I was a big Dave Matthews fan. He's this weird, he grew up like Quaker, basically, you know? And so there's this sort of weird pacifist streak to him and a little bit of an anti-religion, you know, worldviews. But I was interested in it because it still seemed like it was about the same stuff that, let's say, MXPX was talking about in a completely different register, obviously, you know, what they were doing. But really, yeah, as I started to get into like high school and stuff and play music myself, I started gravitating towards pop punk because it's easy to play. And so so that was sort of stuff like that. But like, you know, U2 was obviously a band that like, from like being a very young kid, they struck me as like, oh, these are the guys who are talking about the stuff that is, you know, that I'm interested in music that's about this stuff, you know, these sort of bigger ideas. So I never quite made the full line where it was like, this is Christian and this isn't. But of course, had lots of funny teenage wrestling, internal wrestling about what was okay and what wasn't, you know. And I remember there was like a Guitar World magazine I read in high school where, guys, I'm sorry, but two of the members of POD swore in the interview, and it was a real thing of like, I don't know if I'm allowed to. Yeah. Is this okay for somebody to do? And then, of course, it's like, fast forward a few years, and like Dave Bazan is just like saying, you know, the F word constantly, and I'm totally on board, you know. So, right. But yeah, anyway.
Well, I just listened to a podcast with Jen Hatmaker this morning from on the Daily. And she said shit twice or something, or 3 times in the interview, like a evangelical influencer who's, you know, just swearing in the New York Times, you know.
Things are a little different now.
What a world.
Things are a little different, yeah.
Yeah. So you weren't, you know, it wasn't like Black Sabbath was up against Salty, you know, or something for you. It was like because from what I've read of your other writings and stuff too, you know, appropriate for someone who grew up in the desert in Arizona, you have this sort of like cosmic consciousness that it seems like goes far back with you. I was reading something you wrote about your grandfather when he passed, and just, you know, you just said he was an elder in your church, you know, but you were also driving across the desert with him, listening to ZZ Top or whatever.
That was was a different grandpa.
A different grandpa.
Two different grandpas,
gotcha.
but
2 different.
But ones. I will note that, you know, just the other day I was texting my dad about the grandpa that you're referencing, who was the elder in the church, and I was like, hey, Dad, did Grandpa Woody ever take me up in a Cessna, like one of those little airplanes? Because I'm pretty sure he did. And my dad was like, do you remember that? And I was like, I think like it's like one of my earliest memories is sort of like looking out the window and seeing, you know, whatever. And so anyway, so there was still a sort of, deserty, even that's sort of a cosmic view, you know, idea that I can't help, but it definitely goes all the way back to my youth. Yeah.
Well, so here's a theory that I've just been cooking up throughout the day. Leah often points out, because Leah's area of focus, as you may know, is Pentecostals and charismatics. You know, academically, she studies this. And you've been pushing the theory that so many of the musicians that we talk to or that made it in CCM come from that background, right, of the Pentecostals.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And one of the things you quoted in your piece, Jason, about Ozzy was that he told the New York Times at some time in the 90s that he was a member of the Church of England, that he prays before he goes on stage, he crosses himself. And I'm thinking about how this mismatch of theological traditions could be the root of this sort of like, not a misunderstanding. It's like an intentional, the lines were drawn intentionally, but it is an inability to see each other clearly, I think, for evangelical Christians to even be able to see Ozzy as a fellow Christian. And possibly because that industry is based on this Pentecostal sort of understanding of things, where he's like got this Anglican understanding of things, where he's, the last quote that you have in the piece is that he believes in nature. He doesn't believe in an old man in the sky, but he believes that trees are trees and, nature is nature. And that's something that would be accepted within the Episcopal Church today as a valid expression of faith, I think.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what do you guys think about that as like Ozzy representing a different type of theological framework for the world than what the contemporary Christian or evangelicals might embrace writ large?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would say is it kind of calls to mind, there's another piece that I wrote for Aquarium Drunkards some years back about a group called the Trees Community. And the Trees Community were this like New York commune, and they had sort of come out of the Aquarian age, the East Coast counterculture, where you've got a mismatch of new, influx of like Eastern traditions, all sorts of, experiments with meditation, consciousness altering, through drugs and otherwise. But then they sort of become a sort of modern monastic order, and they forsake all their drugs and they do all this stuff. And they begin this process of like just driving around in this painted bus, and they do their ministry as a sort of art project. And I was talking with the great writer Gregory Thornberry in that piece, who wrote a fantastic book about Larry Norman. I'm sure you guys are super familiar with it. He was like, there are people, the Hal Lindsays of that time were like sort of preaching this apocalyptic sort of, this is all coming to an end. And then you've got the Trees Community sort of espousing a much more generative, cyclical sort of spiritual view that was about the act of continual creation versus, we're coming to the climactic end and everything's done, So I remember writing that piece helped me start to understand that there are, like, as you're saying, just these vastly different worldviews at work within Christianity on, a broad spectrum. But that when you start to get the sort of evangelical, stronghold culturally or whatever, that begins to happen in entertainment. And then you get those weird clashes that maybe just don't exist so much when it's like, Ozzy's coming from a cultural framework, and it's like it's sort of like a thing that, maybe when you break it down, he's a little bit more of like an animist or whatever, but at the same time, to me, it was like sort of an understanding as a younger person that like all those different traditions produced ways of looking at things that could be adopted or not, and I started to like really sort of when you it reminds me of this time that I was talking with my uncle, who was a preacher, as I mentioned, and I brought up something about how people had protested against Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. But I had just recently watched it and found it profoundly moving and very bolstering of my faith. And he was like, "You watched that? Like, that's a deeply, like, sacrilegious kind of film." And it's this weird thing of just sort of realizing, like, I don't think he'd actually kind of engaged the art, which is fine. But just, I was like, well, I don't know if I want to have firmly drawn lines unless I engage with the art and know what it is or isn't. You know what I mean? And found that Sabbath was exactly what we're talking about. But then when you start thinking that way, you start listening to everything, and then you can sort of read it into everything you listen to from there on out. And that happens too. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I can tell you why Big Star was sort of a Christian band. You know what I mean? Or why don't we talk about Prince as a Christian rock artist? Although there's stuff that like legitimately qualifies, you know? So it's a weird one.
Well, yeah. And he even became hardcore Seventh-day Adventist for a while there. Yeah.
I was thinking about just the British American differences as well. So, because you brought that up, and I think that's super helpful, because I was thinking about Led Zeppelin and their like Tolkien influenced stuff.
Yeah, because both bands are Tolkien fans. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, there's a certain kind of like, for lack of a better word, I'm not a music critic, so someone's going to listen to this and be like, oh gosh. But I was thinking about...
You're going to do that because you're a woman either way. So,
also that's true. That's really true. Thanks, Andrew. But I was thinking about, it's like kind of a Gothic like depiction of Christian ideas that sort of, and a kind of mystical reading that is actually very present in certain Pentecostal like idea, like Carmen, you know, we've talked about him a lot of times. Like it's just a different sort of version of it, but you can definitely have that sort of lively kind of mystical cosmology, but it gets depicted differently. And I think there's a sort of cultural Christianity that lets them riff a little bit, because it's an established relationship between the church and the state. If I'm going to get like super into it, like, because the United States, there's a disestablished relationship, you kind of have a way of like relating to culture that's a little bit different. I don't know. I was just thinking, because I was thinking about Ozzy. I'm like, well, I'm thinking about like all those kind of weird rock renditions of Tolkien stuff, which is deeply Christian, you know, but anyway, so I think, and then I was thinking about Springsteen, which is like a very Catholic influenced world that he produces that has a really different way of relating to mainstream culture than any of like the 70s, 80s rock peers in Christian, like the Pentecostally or Baptisty versions.
Yeah, that's a tremendously cool like just notion to think about Springsteen, because he's somebody who, you know, I don't know if you pressed him super hard whether or not he would still sort of claim to be a Christian, but nonetheless, like, it's baked into the music in a way that like it's a similar kind of Catholicism to what we see in Scorsese, or for Springsteen, Flannery O'Connor, obviously, this sort of deep Gothic the blood simple kind of Christianity, you know what I mean? Where he's drawing from that poetic tradition in a way that does make his work feel rooted in a kind of like Christian worldview, but because he's also so closely writing about America, and that line is constantly blurring and getting very difficult to distinguish where one begins and one ends, you know, I think we tend to think of him more as, like you said, sort of a poet of the blue collar, you know, working type. Sure. But as a religious figure, he's a little less, people don't always cite him, but you know, he's doing sort of Pentecostal preacher moves up on stage in the 70s, you know, collapsing and, you know, kissing his bandmates like on the mouth, you know, like it's a very like, you know, he was real far out there in like a way that probably owed to Little Richard or whoever he wanted to be, you know, when he was a kid.
Sure. Yeah.
Rock that doesn't roll.
Hey, Rock That Doesn't Roll listeners. We just want to give you an update on our Patreon support. We have been very heartened to see new people signing up almost every week to help bring this podcast to you. And we could not appreciate it more.
Yeah. So for those of you who may or may not know, this is a work of love. This is a project that comes from the heart. And so we rely on funds from dedicated listeners like you all. Thank you so much to the people who've already decided to give. It's actually, I don't know, it warms my heart. I don't know how you feel about it. Andrew, you were raised Methodist. Is your heart strangely warmed by...
Yeah, just call me John Wesley over here. Yeah. No, it is the thing that, is required to make the show. We are still not really paying ourselves a fair wage, but we are offsetting some of the lost potential earning time that we put into this podcast.
Yeah.
So if you do want the show to continue existing, we do need listeners to support us. And, if that's not financially, you can tell people about us. You could share us on social media, do all other things. But we would love this to be something we can dedicate a lot of time to. But, we have to provide for our families, and we do not each have trust funds. I don't have a trust fund. You don't have a trust fund, do you, Leah?
No,
just
no,
checking. Yeah,
sad to say. Yeah.
So, we appreciate all the support.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Hey, Rock That Doesn't Roll listeners, we want to let you know about an event coming up in October called Theology Beer Camp. It's October 16th to 18th in St. Paul, Minnesota.
I'm really excited about this because it brings together a lot of my favorite things. I'm not really a beer drinker. I feel like I shouldn't say that. But what I really like to do is hang out with people and talk about theology and religion in public life with a lot of really smart people, and think about culture, because really our podcast is about religion and culture. I think in the spirit of those comparison charts, if you like Rock That Doesn't Roll, you'll love Theology Beer Camp, I think is a pretty safe thing to say.
I think there's a pretty good chance that you would. The thing that we want you guys to know is that if you register for this event, which is October 16th to 18th in St. Paul, Minnesota, use our code RTDR and you'll get $75 off your registration.
What a deal.
Again, use the code RTDR and you'll get $75 off registration at Theology Beer Camp 2025. TheologyBeerCamp2025.com is also the URL where you can go to register. Have you guys seen this Devo documentary that just came out?
I just watched it, yeah.
So did you see the part about Dove?
No.
The Band of Love?
Oh, yeah. No, I haven't got that. I'm halfway through, so I haven't got to where they do.
Okay.
Oh, no, I did. It was where they opened for themselves, basically, in a fake Christian...
a fake Christian rock
Never mind.
band.
I did see it.
Yes. And they did a cover of Dylan's Gotta Serve Somebody. So I was like searching YouTube for any examples of, so if you rearrange the letters of Devo, you get Dove, right? So they, in the late 70s, I guess, I don't know the full story. This bears a lot more research, but they, I guess, just would do Christianized versions of Devo songs, kind of, and wear different costumes and do some like televangelist shtick in between songs and try to, annoy the audience, I guess. But I found a recording on YouTube so there's no official releases of Dove, the Band of Love, but as far as I could find. Somebody's uploaded a cover they did of Dylan's Gotta Serve Somebody, and they are just really roasting Dylan. Like, it's got to be, at the height of his Christian era, and they're just, calling him out kind of, or, they're just kind of accusing him of like doing what's popular.
We used to do devil music like that band Devo. But then, Jerry over here, he sat down on a Bobby Dylan record, and the Lord came into him. And now we do music alone.
you just mentioned Springsteen, and I just started thinking of Dylan, and just the Christian turn of it, the explicit Christian turn of it, and just the idea that like Dylan only did 3 Christian albums, or has every album he's done since then still been a Christian album.
I mean, I think
just because he did Infidels, but
you could make a real case that like Rough and Rowdy Ways is kind of a Christian I mean, there's so many. I don't think he quit being explicit about it or as direct about it as he was in that moment.
Right.
I do think those records are underrated, and I do think that whatever his reasons for that conversion were, I do think they were pretty sincere. I think he was really coming from a place of pure conviction, and I love reading people like T-Bone Burnett, who was sort of in that same Southern California sort of scene where there's a crossover between the music world, and he's working with like, was it Leslie
Phillips?
Well, Leslie Phillips.
Well, right, that's his.
Sam Phillips, Leslie Phillips, like she had her like CCM records and then sort of her secular ones, but she's singing about God on both, and it's like, I love listening to T-Bone talk about that time, because he just says there was like a spirit of the gospel in the air among the Dylan camp, and so he's in love with the backup singer, and we know he asked Mavis Staples to marry him way back in the 60s, so I mean, I think he was in love with gospel. I think he was in love with these new found ideas, and it was very zealous in that way that some people are right at first, and then figured out how to maybe keep it in there, but a little less in your face, a little bit.
I was just editing this part where Gregory and I are talking about Dylan's Christian albums, and I was like, well, yeah, those could have been Larry Norman albums, and he's like, no, those were more extreme than Larry Norman albums. Those were more aggressive and in your face, Jesus-y,
It's true. Larry Norman was like funnier and a little bit more like, hey, chill, man, it's cool.
Yeah, more nuanced, kind of, like less in your face.
Yeah, well, that was just his charismatic face, his charismatic Pentecostal phase.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, like it fits the conventions of that, like of that crew. You can tell he was hanging out. He was going to certain kinds of Bible studies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was pretty concerned about the end of the world being very, very, very at hand. And I think that in a certain way, I find it kind of baffling, but maybe somehow understandable that like all these years later, we're still stuck in that same thing. Like there's people right now who are sort of like, the end is at hand due to all of this stuff going on. And it's like, well, this has been going on now for decades. Like,
like we've been in the eternal now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just we're stuck in the same moment since 1970.
Yeah, history ended, and we didn't come up with any new, we have to come up with new, fun, apocalyptic things to have occur. New, fun, novel ones. We can try.
Yes.
Let's try some new ones out.
I do think, to be fair to Dylan and all of his colleagues, that in that era, there was apocalypticism just like writ large in the United States, about the bomb, about like the Cold War. So I think in some ways it's like you could look at it as a Christianized, like a Pentecostalized version of anxieties that people were just feeling in the culture more broadly. And because, there were lots of legit concerns about the end of the world through nuclear warfare and things like that. So to be fair.
No, totally. And I think that, and those also still ring true and pressing in the current day. You know what I mean? These sort of like, but there was obviously a reckoning with like sort of the post-war order of things, and when you listen to those Dylan sermons from around that time, when they did the box set of the release, they excised all those sermons, which and just included the music, which does rip, because they're like, it still sounds like everybody's on cocaine. I don't know if people really were, but it still sort of sounds like everybody was. They took all of those sermons out because he was just in that moment really hyper fixated on the Middle East and these sort of, Hal Lindsey informed kind of like, this is going down right now. And, and it's easy to understand why people felt like that.
I said, Russia's going to attack the Middle East, and they went, ooh. They couldn't hear that. They didn't believe it. And a month later, Russia moved their troops into, I think Afghanistan it was. And the whole situation changed,
He recruited Jews for Jesus to come to his concerts and proselytize people,
I remember that organization coming to my church as a kid and just sort of being like, I don't know if I get this. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
I think they came to my college at least once, but because like when you're like, okay, well, if you don't think about it for more than 30 seconds, you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. JC was a Jew, but then you go a little, think for a full minute, and then you're just wondering about that. Yeah.
I think that's it shows how influential people like Hal Lindsey were, because there's like that form of Zionism is so core to that form of apocalypticism. Yeah. So like those two things, it's like in a lot of ways you can't have one without the other. So I think that says a lot about how deep he was in those circles, that it seemed obvious to be like, hey, come to my, So regardless of what he thinks of that today.
To go back to Ozzy, though, I did, one of the quotes you have in your piece about him was how people were constantly trying to proselytize him, and that he had probably 25 Bibles that people have given him over the years. And I even saw a recent, just the day he died, Instagram served me up this account called Celebrity Evangelist. Have you guys seen this guy?
No.
So it's a guy, that's the handle, Celebrity Evangelist. He has 22.7 thousand followers.
Cool.
And he just goes to celebrity meet and greets. He buys a ticket, and he brings personalized Bibles and gives them to these celebrities, and tries to tell them about Jesus.
Of course.
Very old school thing. I had there was a friend of my older brother's whose mom was determined to get Eddie Vedder to become a Christian. This in the early 90s, and she was just writing letters all the time. The mom. It was a cool mom.
Did she have kind of a little crush? I'm assuming.
My mom had a crush on Eddie Vedder. 100%.
I mean, I also have a crush on Eddie Vedder.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
there's no shame in that.
These may have been age appropriate women.
Sure.
I think, but yeah, and it's just wild. That guy, did his whole thing with Ozzy, a few years ago, and he was trying to recount Jack Osbourne, I saw him at another meet and greet, and he said that my dad really appreciated the Bible you gave me, and it meant so much to him. So I think he may have read it, and we might have finally gotten Ozzy, even though he's the 50th person who's done that.
Yeah.
Or 500th. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved that quote. I mean, again, because I think that Ozzy's a media construction as much as he is anything else, and I mean, and so it's you can understand the way he leaned into his image and was a celebrity, but I think that the sort of what he represented for some Christians was a true demonic threat that was coming at them via all angles, right? On the radio, or they're turning on MTV and seeing him and all this stuff. And so it's I think a lot about that. I do think that I first got warned against Ozzy as the satanic panic is going on. And I don't know the satanic panic is going on. I'm just growing up in it and hearing these stories about things and just assuming, yeah, there's just cult guys everywhere and they are
Right.
constantly trying to get us, you know?
Right.
And that was just the weird milieu of hearing that stuff. So I definitely feel like he dovetailed with that cultural moment of, you know, and he probably wasn't doing himself any big favors by like biting the heads off winged creatures or, you know, or posing, you know, in some of the photos and the videos and stuff. You know, he probably could have cleared it up a little bit if he had tried. But anyway.
But remaining, you know, that keeping up the kayfabe,
Yeah.
you know, was kept the
It's
tickets
it's like
going,
when you
know,
hear
and all
about
that,
Alice
yeah.
Cooper being like a complete. Alice Cooper is like a Baptist, like Christian. He's a
Right.
Christian. He lives here in Arizona. You know, people see him around. He is a religious guy. But Alice Cooper is a character he created to entertain people. You know what I mean? And it's the real guy and that character, they maybe sometimes they're the same, but not always, you know? And I feel like there's just an understanding of that now that is, you know, I don't know if it's like more acceptable now for the lines to be blurry or I don't know. But, you know, I feel like nobody really bats an eye if like Kid Rock says he's a Christian artist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nor does anybody expect him not to still rap about like strippers and stuff, you know. It's like it's just like that line has kind of been obliterated a little bit in some ways culturally, where it's like no, I'm a Christian, meaning I am coded culturally this way, and you can get on board. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's a weird time.
Yeah, we are in strange days. Yeah. Any final thoughts there? Or?
Well, I was just thinking, like, it's just good business to do that stuff, especially in the 80s. I mean, I'm like, we should talk to Sharon Osbourne. I'm sure she would have all kinds of thoughts about, like, why that was a good idea. And, you know, I mean, I think that's just, all that stuff just equaled more record sales. And the people, I'm not sure what Ozzy thought about it, but I'm sure that the people who are paying attention to merch were attending to that.
Yeah, I mean, and you're 100% right. Like, Sharon was like, we got to start doing this reality TV thing. And, like, if we don't live just in the wrestling age of culture, we also live in the reality TV age of culture. And, like, Ozzy and his family were on the cutting edge of that. We're some of the first people who will be like, oh, we'll have cameras follow us around our house while we're doing normal things. And people will maybe watch it. And I did watch it. You know what I mean? And so Ozzy became that much more lovable. It was just sort of like Snoop Dogg's the same way, where it's like, once you watch Snoop Dogg enough on TV, you're like, he seems really nice, you know? But I remember when he was still the cultural boogeyman and people were scared of Snoop Dogg, you know?
Right,
and you'd listen to that early Snoop Dogg stuff and be like, it does sound scary. I get why people, you know what I mean? So... so Ozzy he's a strange case, but the Prince of Darkness, you know, might have been playing a role, you know, for everybody's benefit to play around with those ideas of good and evil. And I think that at the end of the day, he's strangely, you could really make the case that he was one of the first, that Sabbath record is one of the first Christian metal records. And so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even beyond just the song After Forever.
After Forever, which is
that
like...
That song is explicit.
Oh, yeah.
It's, you know,
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about your soul? Can it be saved? Or perhaps you think that when you are dead, you just stay in your grave? Is God just a thought within your head, or is it part of you? Is Christ just a name that you read in the book when you were in school?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Jason. feels like this flew by, but we'll keep reading what you're putting out there. Where should people look to find your stuff? Is there one spot? Or?
Yeah, I mean, probably just find me on Instagram, at Jason P. Woodbury, and I put links to the different stuff I do for Aquarium Drunkard and Wastoids, which is a video podcast thing that I do with friends and collaborators, and post the Substack stuff. I try to be good with the Substack, but then I'll hit, a wall and not put one up for a couple weeks and then have to just feel bad about it and then beat myself up
Substack.
and then, yeah.
Substack to me is like pen pals. Like, it seems like a really good idea, and then I just don't have the follow through to get it out there.
It is
my sympathies.
But that said, I put stuff up every now and then, and I am working towards, maybe some work that's a little more geared specifically towards this idea. And so for now, Substack is working as a somewhat irregular way to get some of those ideas out there and explore stuff like this Ozzy thing that I could have probably published on Aquarium Drunkard or adapted for Wastoids, but felt like I wanted to do it in this other way. So that for now, Substack will work for that. But yeah, I post stuff on that. And then, of course, I have music and stuff out because I make a lot of music these days as well. So
so look on Bandcamp for that.
Yeah,
stuff.
check us out on Bandcamp for sure.
Nice.
Well, thanks for that, and thanks for joining us
thank
today.
you guys.
Yeah.
I love the show. I'm a big fan,
awesome.
and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
for
Well,
having me.
we'll keep reading and look for new conversations to have with you. So if you'll come back, we'll.
I'd love to.
Thanks for listening, and also find us on Substack and Instagram by searching Rock That Doesn't Roll.
And of course, you should give us a rating and review on whatever podcast app you're using to listen right now. Rock That Doesn't Roll is an independent production supported by you, our listeners, and distributed by PRX.
Our original score is by Jim Cooper of Infomercial USA.
I'm Leah Payne, and the show's producer and co-host is the one and only Andrew Gill.
Remember, rock all you want, but watch it when you start to roll. Thanks so much for listening to this entire episode all the way to the end. Give yourself a pat on the back. And if you enjoy the show this much, consider becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/RTDR. Thanks so much.